The festival of Purim, the Feast of Lots or the Feast of Esther, occurs this year the first week in March of 2015, but it really ought to be a timeless holiday. It can occur any time between the middle of February and perhaps the middle of March, according to the Jewish calendar. It is a holiday that, while celebrated only for one day, really ought to linger on not just for a few days afterwards, but for the weeks and hopefully for the full year afterwards. It is a particularly joyous holiday based on the story in the biblical book of Esther, one of the 5 scrolls that make up the 3rd section of the Tanakh of Hebrew Scriptures. The story is told from a scroll called the Megillah. This happens to be a very beautiful Megillah owned by our congregation for many, many years. The scroll itself and the case really tell the story of Purim, the story of a Jewish community in ancient Shushan that were beleaguered, that were singled out for destruction by a cruel and vindictive Haman. During this telling of the story, every time the name of Haman is mentioned, those young and old are invited to make noise with a noisemaker called a grogger. And indeed, there are different ways of making noise. That's one of the elements of the observance of Purim. A second is called Mishloach Manot, to give gifts of food and sweets to your friends and to your neighbors, a way of sharing with them the joy of the holiday. A third element to the observance of Purim is called Matanot LaEvyonim, giving gifts to the poor, so that even in rejoicing over the fact that the Jewish people survived, one ought to always be conscious of those who are the unfortunate in our society. And then the fourth element of Purim is called Ad Lo Yada, that one should get themselves into a kind of a stupor so that they no longer can tell the difference between the wicked Haman and the very righteous Mordecai. And that's an invitation at least one time a year, and that ought to only be one day a year, to get oneself in a totally different mood. Purim is a holiday that has much to tell us about the joys of life that we so often overlook and take for granted.